Good evening. So, we are going to continue over our study over the life of Christ. We did do a portion of it on this past Sunday evening, and it was over Who Do You Say That I Am, which was in the Gospel of Matthew. But some of the things that have kind of taken place, just in case you missed on Sunday, this is essentially the final year of the life of Christ. So we're approaching, everything is kind of looking towards the cross at this point in his final triumphal entry. So, and we're going to see a little bit of him talking about that this evening if we make it to it. But this is essentially the final life. So he's entering year 3 of his earthly ministry. A lot of things have taken place. Some of the most recent things, Jesus has fed the 5,000. He's walked on the water, which we've talked about. That's in John 6 and Mark 6. Also in Matthew. He's told them that he's the bread of life, which is the one that some of the people actually ended up leaving Jesus over because it was, not only was it necessarily a hard teaching, but they also were a bit confused by it. If you could imagine if someone came to you and said, "You're going to eat of my flesh and drink of my blood," and you were missing the context, you were looking at the physical and not the spiritual, you might also be a little bit thrown off guard. And it's something that Jesus faced a lot with a lot of these things. Even whenever he fed the 5,000, people were looking at the physical aspect of being fed instead of the spiritual the facet of it, if I can talk, the spiritual side of it, thinking about Jesus can give them the bread, the daily bread that lasts for eternity. He can give the water, the living water that you'll never thirst again, and all those things. And so time after time and after time, people are missing the point, and they're looking at the physical, which we're going to see again tonight, instead of the spiritual side of it. So Jesus has walked on the water. He's talked about the bread of life, and people, some of the people left Jesus. And we talked about this several weeks back, but Jesus did not chase after them. I think that's maybe something that we can get in our mind today. If someone gets upset with the teaching, some of the first things that people in the world do today is they're like, "I'm sorry I said it that way," and then they'll try to change the truth of what it is instead of just. Now, if you didn't present it in love, that's a whole other story. I'm saying if you presented it in love and you presented the truth is what it is, especially if you presented it in love. And that's exactly what Jesus did, and people left. Jesus did not go after them. Now, Jesus wanted them to stay with him, obviously. But Jesus had given them the truth, and he cared and loved them enough to give them the truth, which is something that they were not wanting to hear. And we have to remember that as well. We have to love people enough to give them the truth, and sometimes they're not going to want to hear it. After that, Jesus said he is that he has the words for eternal life, which leads us into what we talked about on Sunday night, which was... I'm in the wrong gospel. Go back to Matthew. If you go back to Matthew 16, that's where we'll kind of do our focus tonight. But Peter makes a great confession. And if you remember, just as a quick recap from Sunday evening, Jesus comes to Caesarea Philippi, and he asks the disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And he's really asking, what is the popular opinion? What do the masses think about me? And I think that's an interesting question if you were to think about that today. If you were to ask the world today, who do you think Jesus is, you're going to get 1,000 different answers. If you ask different denominations, you might even get different answers. And so there's a lot of different things that can confuse people, and Jesus is not interested about being the most popular answer or this, that, or the other. Jesus is more worried about the follow-up question, which is what we talked about the majority of the time on Sunday evening. But who do you say that I am? Who does your life say that Jesus is? What do your words say that Jesus is? Are you living a life that proves that you are a child of God, or are you living a life contrary to that? Do the words that you speak to other people back up the fact that you're a Christian, or do they maybe deny the fact that you're not really following after him because you're not speaking in love, or this, that, or the other? Who do you say Jesus is? And I think that's something that all of us need to think about, because we can be asked that question a lot in a lot of different phrases. People may not walk up to you and say, "Who do you think Jesus is?" But they very well could be like, "Well, how are you doing today?" "I'm doing great. The Lord has blessed me with another day." "Why are you so happy today when everything seems to be so chaotic around you?" "Because I know that the Lord will provide." There's many different ways that people may ask a certain question that you can respond with, "Because Jesus, because of this, because I have a higher hope." I'm not relying on the hope of this world that's going to be empty at the end. I'm relying on the hope of heaven and the hope that Jesus is going to continue to keep all of his promises, that we know that he will. And one of the things that we did not touch on Sunday evening was the response that Jesus gives in verse 17 of Matthew 16. So Jesus answers Peter after Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus says in verse 17, "And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven.'" You see, the responses at the very beginning were, they were looking at the physical thing, and we're going to study this a little bit later on, but people were really thinking that Jesus was going to be someone coming back, one of the prophets of old. And Jesus is saying, flesh and blood has not revealed this, but the Heavenly Father has. What has the Heavenly Father revealed to us today? The Word. Right? Don't we have a lot of Word? Now, they here, of course, did not have this physical text, nor could they read some of the things talking about Elijah and John the Baptist, but they could have known. There could have been things there. But he says, the Father in heaven has. And in verse 18, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, verse 18 is a verse that Catholicism is going to use to basically say that Peter was the first pope. And then you can get into the fact that Peter had a mother-in-law, this, that, and the other. But the rock of the church is Jesus, because Jesus' gift to the church is what sets up, it's the whole cornerstone of it. You have to have a solid cornerstone to even have the rock. The other portion of the rock that you could say would be Peter's statement, the fact that he is confessing Jesus to be the Son of God. So you have two different things there, because your faith, the fact that you are going to accept Jesus as the Son of God, is the foundation of your Christianity. If you don't get that point correct, right, it doesn't really matter what else you do afterwards if you're not even believing he's the Son of God, right? You've kind of forsaken everything else. You also can't just stop at the simple believing fact, because if you truly believe that Jesus is the Son of God, then if you love him, what will you do? He says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments," right? So it goes hand in hand. There's so much more to it. And so our faith, we have to have a faith that knows that Jesus is the Son of God. That has to be kind of part of our foundation. And he says, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Who is the church? I think this is something that we have almost changed the meaning of the word almost in some new lingo that we use now. Here's the church, and we look at the building, and if we're not careful, we say, I've said this probably the last 2-3 weeks, and I guess I'm going to keep saying it, I'm going to church. You're going to worship, because we're the church. The people are the church. The body is the church, right? And Christ is what? The head. And so sometimes when we say we're going to church, we can go and we can just sit there. If we say we're going to worship, what is that? We're going to participate. We're going to be active. We're going to engage with the Scripture. We're going to engage with the singing. We're going to be a part of worship. And so he says, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." When you think about the keys of the kingdom, in Revelation 1:17 through 18, we read in verse 17 of Revelation 1, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore.'" Who are we speaking of here? Jesus. "I have the keys of death and Hades." Who holds the keys? Whose power, whose blood is the one that has the keys so that we can contact it and get access? It's the blood of Christ that helps us get there, is it not? When we follow him and we chase after him, when we contact that blood, when we do those different things, that is how we gain access to the hope of heaven that is above. And when you think about verse 19, when it says, "Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven," this is something that Jesus has talked about numerous times, and he's going to talk about here again in the future. Some of the people were more worried about Jesus feeding them actual food than thinking about the food that was going to last them for forever. Even the woman at the well, several I guess, a year prior to this conversation, was thinking about, well, how do I get that living water? How do I get a water that I never, give me that water. But time and time again, people keep going back to the physical instead of thinking of the spiritual. And this right here, verse 19, remember it as we get to the next part. Verse 20 says, then he strictly charged the disciples, and he says this to numerous people. Almost everybody he heals, he ends up saying the same thing. Tell no one that he was the Christ. Now, when he heals people, now tell no one I did this, right? He does that numerous times, and then what happens? So what's the first thing those people do? They go and they tell everybody. But Jesus is not in it to be an earthly king. He's not in it for the popularity and things like that. He's in it because he loves us and he cares for us. When you go into verse 21, it says from that time, so this is the final kind of, you're approaching the final year, so everything towards this is kind of heading up towards the cross. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. So now he's starting to say, hey, this is what's coming, right? We've gone 2 years. We've been ministering for 2 years. This is what is coming. In verse 22, Peter says, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Could you imagine being Peter in this moment? Peter has so many just fascinating things that we have recorded. From the, probably the most famous one I feel like everyone just holds to Peter is whenever he denies Jesus 3 times, right? But look at Peter right here. Peter's like, I'm going to pull Jesus aside, right, who he's just said is the Son of the living God, right? So now Peter's like, I'm going to pull him aside. No one is going to kill this guy. I've got him covered, right? And if you think about the 2 statements, if he is the Son of God, then what are you really going to do about it? Right? If he wants to take care of it, he can most definitely take care of it. But I love Peter's attitude here. And he says, and so Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. It is just marvelous to think that, or interesting to think that Peter thought to do that. Saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. So Peter here has the best of intentions. And I think sometimes we can have the best of intentions too. But we're here again going back to the physical side of Jesus instead of thinking of the spiritual side. What if Peter was right? What if Peter had his way and he could protect Jesus so that Jesus would never die? What would happen? What would that mean for not only Peter but all of us? There'd be no forgiveness for sin, which is exactly why when you look at verse 23, but he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. See?
Kind of reminds me of the transfiguration when Peter impulsively said, I want to build 3 tabernacles. Well, this is sort of being physical about a very spiritual thing that was happening.
Yeah, and the transfiguration is one of the next things that comes up after this scenario. And so it's interesting when you think about just how Peter, I think Peter's a really, really good example of a lot of us sometimes. A lot of people like to get onto Peter. He walks out of the boat, and then he gets just, he loses sight of Jesus, and he sinks in the water, and then Jesus saves him, right? We all know that story when Peter and Jesus walked on water. And then you think about this scenario right here. Peter pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him, saying that, no, we're going to take care of you. And then you think about Peter at the end, or Peter at the transfiguration, where he's trying to do these different things, especially after he just made this great confession about Jesus being the Son of God. And when you look at that first statement, get behind me, Satan. It is such a strong, direct statement. And Peter, I don't think, fully understands at this moment what exactly he's doing. He's not really seeing kind of the end goal of what has to take place in order for salvation to be obtained by all of us. Jesus says, you are a hindrance to me. You're a stumbling block to me. How is Peter a hindrance or a stumbling block to the Lord?
It would be a great temptation to Jesus to take the shortcut and not go to the cross.
Did Jesus, I don't know how you want to say this, I guess there's a right, well, both answers are probably right. Did Jesus really want to go to the cross? Yes, because he loved us. What did he pray in the garden? Let this cup pass. Let this cup be removed. And you have to think, he's now approaching less than a year away from that moment. And I'm going to try to keep up with some of the dates. So as you can see, like, for example, the story of Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus up in a tree, you're not very far away from Jesus actually being put on a cross. I mean, you're just outside of the final week of his life when that moment happens, and Jesus stops and notices Zacchaeus up in a tree. So he's on his way to essentially his resting place, yet he still stops for someone who's looking after him. The love and the compassion is just unmatched. And so he says, you're a hindrance to me. People are trying to make Jesus king. You know, Peter's saying, no, we'll protect you. He's a hindrance to what? The plan that God has put before him. The plan that God has put before Jesus. Jesus knows he has to come and fulfill this. He says, for you are not setting your mind on things of God, but on things of man. I think we should all look at verse 23 and then reflect back on our life and think when we might need to be saying, when we're making decisions, get behind me, Satan. Because I think too often in our life we're making decisions not setting our mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And if you go back several, maybe 4 or 5 lessons back, Jesus is telling them, stop going after the bread that is temporary. Go after the bread that is eternal. That is our life today. So many people are chasing a dollar instead of chasing salvation. So many people are worried about their next promotion at work, but they're not thinking about a promotion to heaven, I guess you could say, right? Gaining heaven. There is so many times in our life when we could be tempted by things, when we could, people could maybe even be a hindrance to us. And here, Peter is not trying to be a hindrance. Peter thinks he's being a help, which is something that I think we need to think about too, because sometimes we think we can be helping. And that's when we need to go back, and that's why we have to make sure that we're in accordance with God's word as well. Peter is here on accident being a hindrance because he's not setting his things on the things above. He's setting his things on the things of this earth. So let that be a reminder for us, and let us not be afraid to say, get behind me, Satan, whenever we get tempted with those things. That's something that Jesus essentially said whenever he was tempted in the wilderness. And Satan even came at him with Scripture. And what did Jesus use? Right back with Scripture. That's something else we should also be able to do, is be able to use Scripture in return. Any questions? Or there's one, I couldn't even ask it.
On verse 19, Peter wasn't given the power to bind and loose, but it was the translation should be already bound in heaven, already loosed in heaven. So Peter wasn't making that decision, well, I'm going to bind this and I'm going to loose this.
Correct. Yeah, and that would also go into the verses before when people would use that verse to basically say Peter was the first pope, which we can go into that's probably a whole lesson. Do you have something, Dale?
Yeah, it's singular here when he's talking to just Peter. He says, I will give you singular the keys of heaven, and whatever. And Sue's right, is whatever has been bound, whatever has been loosed already in heaven. 2 chapters later, in chapter 18, I think it's verse 18, Jesus says to all the disciples the same phrase: whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven.
Yep.
Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. And so if he's making Peter the pope by what he says here in chapter 16, then you got 12 popes, including Judas.
Yep. And if you look, so you referenced Matthew 18. It's Matthew 18:18. He says, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven.
Yeah,
So
you
the same.
plural.
Yep. And so, and you think about it, I think I've mentioned this maybe, it's probably 4 or 5 months ago. What is your life telling Jesus you want to inherit after your physical life is over? I think that's a question we could think about. We should all be thinking about, especially after we finish each day and as we wake up each morning, how do we want to live our life? But, and it sounds probably harsh when I say it, but if you think about it, I mean, not necessarily. Why would Jesus reward someone with heaven if they don't even want to participate in worship, and they don't want to pray, and they don't want to go to church, and they don't want to read His Word? Why would He reward you with something that you don't even want to do here? Wouldn't that almost be a punishment to send that person that doesn't even like that to go to heaven? Wouldn't that almost be a punishment? Now on the flip side, you say, well, no, that would not be a punishment because they would want to be in heaven once they see it, right? but what is our life saying that we want to spend eternity with? And so I think that's something. We think the singing here is good. It might just be better somewhere else. We think the fellowship is good here. It might just be better somewhere else. It definitely will be. Kathy?
I'm going to go a step further and say that, well, as an English teacher, I'm going to say that it's actually past perfect, will have already been found.
Mhm.
And so we forget that from the beginning, it all started in the Old Testament, and we've been studying about this, how the Old Testament leads to Christ, and everything is about the story of Jesus coming to redeem us back to God the way we originally were supposed to be, right? And so we forget that, Jesus his kingdom was established already. Like, we're part of the kingdom. It's here, and you were saying if we don't even like to do these things, well, that's true, because the kingdom is here. We are part of the kingdom. And if we're not participating in worshiping the Lord and wanting to be with Him and worshiping Him, and honoring Him and obeying Him, what's the point? We've got to want to do it right now, right here.
Yeah. And if you think about it, there's some groups, I don't know, whatever word you want to use, that are essentially, and I think we can fall into this if we're not careful, so we need to always make sure we're mindful of this. We can try to make going to worship or church, as some people say, as convenient as possible. 30 minutes, in, out. An hour, that's what I give a week, right? And Dale's done, I think, statistics on this, on about how many times you can engage with the Word. But if all you can give to the Lord is an hour a week, or 2 hours a week, even 5 hours a week, if that's all you can muster up out of a whole week, the reward of eternity doing that all the time, it wouldn't seem like a reward in that eye. And so I think we need to be thinking about, too, how much of our time are we dedicating to things of God instead of thinking of things of the world? And I think that's very hard for us. It's probably the hardest thing for Western culture to kind of wrap their head around, because everything in Western culture, we are so blessed with many things. We have more wealth than we even know what to do with. That's why we have so many storage units. That's why we have all these big vehicles and bigger houses, and we have more things than we know what to do with. It can be a huge blessing. The technology can be a huge blessing if you use it the right way, right? But if we start looking at all those things instead of setting our mind on the things above, all those things can become a hindrance, right? Chasing after a bigger house can now become a hindrance on you getting to heaven. Chasing after the next promotion because you want more money can become a hindrance on you getting to heaven. Relying on technology and only watching church off of your computer can be a hindrance because now you're not fellowshipping with the other believers. And you can go down the whole laundry list of things, right? We are so blessed with so many things in America. But those same things, if you don't use them the right way, can also turn into a hindrance. But they can also be good. So let us make sure that we're using them for good and using them for the benefit of the kingdom. Especially technology. You can use technology for a lot in the kingdom.
When you use the word hindrance, which you started out with, how was Peter going to be a hindrance to Christ by providing him as a security or bodyguard?
Yeah.
Well, that hindrance is that he took it totally out of God's hands and put it in his. And that's what we do all the time. We're going to take care of it ourselves. And that's a hindrance.
Yep. We, trying to think if I want to say this or not. There has been past presidents. This is not to get political, but this just shows like kind of the human nature. This is just one aspect. We do this in our life every time. There's been past presidents that have made political decisions with other countries because they think it will help speed up the return of Christ. They think that they can help with Christ coming back. And if you want to ask me after class, you can ask me after class. I'll tell you all more about it. But we in our life can do the exact same thing. And we can try to basically just go ahead, as you mentioned, and just knock it out ourselves, do it ourselves. And all of a sudden, now we can start becoming a hindrance to what God's will really is, what God really desires for us, you know. And that's chasing after all these different things. And God's like, will you just look at the heavenly decisions and not the earthly decisions, the fleshly decisions. And I think I know it's hard for me, and I imagine it's probably challenging for every single person in here. There is just so many earthly things, especially in America, that are just, they're everywhere. I mean, we're bombarded with technology, and you can't even, a sporting event. You got to have a commercial break. It drives me nuts when I go to a Tennessee game. The little guy comes out there, puts the little thing down, 3.5 minutes for a commercial. Why do they do that? Because they got to sell you on something. So then you can get back to, whatever the product is. But they got to sell you on something first so you can spend more money, right? And it's always just a sell and a sell and a sell. Everything's just kind of right there before you, and we live off of a time clock. Everything is time-based, right? Time for a Christian is eternity, because we don't taste that second death, because we're just moving straight on to eternity. So we have to keep our mind on that.
I was just going to say, along with what you were both saying, Proverbs 3:5 and 6, trust in the Lord with all thine heart.
Yep.
And lean not to thine own understanding, in all thy ways, I'm losing it all of a sudden, but in all thy ways,
Yeah.
down.
Acknowledge is true. Yeah.
Thank you. That word wouldn't come to me. Sorry.
You're good. Happens to me all the time. But no, sometimes I do it a lot, so I can go ahead and say it, I guess. But I try to lean on my understanding way too much, and I'm sure I'm not the only one here. We think we're strong enough. We think we're smart enough. We think we've got it all figured out. And so we have to remember that our hope, our strength, really comes from the Lord and not from us.
But in Peter's defense, he didn't understand, he didn't realize he was still looking for an earthly kingdom.
Yep.
And he did love the Lord so much. And so we try to protect those that we love, and that was the human side of him. That he was not trying to be a hindrance, but he had so much love for the Savior that he wanted to save him and didn't understand what the whole plan was at that point.
Yeah, and you have to think even up until the end, Peter and some of the others are still not fully grasping what it is. And so, and that's a good point, because we do have to keep in mind that, because right here, Peter is not trying to be a hindrance. It almost happens, he's trying to do a good thing. Like he's really trying to help him out, but he's missing the point that Jesus has to die in order for us to get salvation, in order for us to get to heaven. And so it's kind of contrary to what our human nature would be to think that. Dale?
He's got a lot of zeal here, and he's
Yeah.
just gotten the answer right.
Yeah.
When Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" Right? He's gotten the right answer. Boy, he's pumped up by that. And he's got all
Yeah.
the zeal, and he's ready to go. And you see that here. You see it on the Mount of Transfiguration.
Yep.
You see that zeal of Peter, because he feels emboldened now that he's got the answer right. That okay, I'm on the right path.
Yeah. No, I think both of those are good points. Because Peter, well, I'll tell you what, Peter, especially if you look back, Peter does something that a lot of us should be doing. When Jesus asks the question, "Who do you say that I am?" Who speaks up? Peter does for the crowd. So often we can be like, tough question, and we'll let someone else answer. Peter knew the answer. He said the answer. Peter was confident in his answer. We should be confident in our answer too, right? And we should be the one that's willing to speak up and boldly speak up. But yeah, Peter was not trying to be a hindrance. It happens because of his zeal and because of his love for the Lord. And it all goes into, especially what Jesus is about to say next, he's trying to help them change from thinking earthly things and changing to spiritual things. It's something they dealt with here. It's something that we still deal with today. And so when it goes into verse 24, it says, "Then Jesus told his disciples, 'If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.'" So take up his cross and follow me. So now Jesus, for the next essentially year of his life, Jesus is going to be he's going to be saying all these things going towards the cross. And time after time after time, they're not going to fully grasp what is to take place. And so he says, "Take up your cross and follow me." Verse 25, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Now, we talked about this on Sunday evening. Jesus, he tells us, there is no other, I'm going to miss the verse now. What a greater friend there is than one that will give up their life for the other friend. I'm totally paraphrasing the verse because I just blank on it. But there's no greater friendship than a friend that would give up their life for the other. And right here, this is exactly what Jesus is going after. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Verse 26, this is where you really get your answer to it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Circle, highlight, underline. That goes back into everything that Jesus has been talking about for the last several passages we've been studying over the last couple weeks. What does it matter if you get that promotion if you lose your soul? What does it matter if you're the most popular person in X group if you lose your soul? What does it matter if you live in the fanciest house in the neighborhood if you lose your soul? What does it matter if you know every single scripture but you don't love and you lose your soul? Kathy?
You know, here he's also trying to get across to Peter, hey, you're going to have to go through a lot more than, I mean, you can't handle what you're about to go through. You're
Yeah.
about to go through some serious stuff, and even face death, you know, and for my sake. And he starts talking to him about, I'm going to have a cross, and are you going to follow me? Are you going to take up yours? And you're going to have to humble yourself. And then not long after that, he goes to the Mount of Transfiguration, of course.
Yep.
And they don't get it, but they're humble.
Yep.
You know, he keeps bringing them down a notch or two every time they think, oh, we're going to do this for you. And he's like, wait a minute, you don't know what you're getting into. Let me explain this to you.
Yep.
And he keeps trying to give them little bits and pieces of little foreshadowings of what they're going to go up against.
Yeah, I think a good way to look at this is Jesus is planting a lot of seeds and the light bulb's not gone off yet. But the light bulb is going to go off in about a year and some change, maybe a little bit less than a year depending on how the date falls. But the light bulb is going to go off right there after Jesus ascends, and you get into Acts 1 and Acts 2. That's when you start seeing the light bulb go off. And then when it goes off, doesn't it? And you get your first sermon right there in Acts 2. But I think verse 26 is perfect for us. I'm not going to say perfect for us today. It's a challenging verse for us today. And it's one that I think we really need to think about because what are we trying to gain? Are we trying to gain earthly possessions or are we trying to gain heaven? And our soul is the most important thing. There is so many people in our lives that could be a hindrance. There are so many different things that could be a hindrance in our life. Our main focus on where is my soul going to be? That needs to be, when we make decisions, how does this affect my soul? Because if we're thinking on this is going to be a positive thing for my soul, then we're going to be making biblical and God heavenly decisions, right? I had another train of thought and I just lost it. See, it happens to me too. You started it. You brought that in here, I tell you what.
You had a thought, but it died alone.
Do what?
You had a thought, but it died alone.
It did. It's all about self.
Another thing on that verse 24, so many people today in trying to write and get greeting cards or whatever, say, follow your own heart, do what makes you happy. And here Jesus is saying the opposite in verse 24, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me.
So this might sound edgy, I don't know. One of the biggest phrases you hear today, and this is not a jab at anybody, hear me out before I say this, before you just cut me off. One of the biggest phrases that people use today is my body, my choice. And they use it for everything. People use it for if there's a birthing matter. People used it with COVID and the vaccine. My body, my choice. Now stop. If you're a Christian, is it your body and your choice? Because if you're a Christian, what are you? You're part of the church. Who's the head of that body? Whose body are you in? You're in the body of Christ. So it's not your body. And as Sudis mentioned, who are we to follow? Christ. So it's His body, His choice. Now I think the people that came up with that phrase probably are not, do not proclaim to be Christians. But I think we need to be careful of that because that's something people say it all the time, and I don't think people necessarily think about it. But in our kind of Western culture, we can be like, no, this is my body, my choice. I get to do me. If you're a Christian, it's God's body and God's choice. And that's how our life needs to reflect. And so we need to think about that when we make decisions. I still can't think what I was going to say about the return for his soul, but it'll come to me eventually. Verse 27 says, "For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now, verse 28 might confuse some people because they're like, oh, so Jesus is going to come back before these people have perished. I think, was it Sue that mentioned it maybe earlier? No, it was Kathy. The kingdom is going to be established here shortly before these people, before this generation passes. So if there's any confusion there, he's talking about a different kingdom coming whenever he establishes his kingdom here. But it says the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father. Now, how is Jesus also going to come back on his second coming? Who's he coming back with?
Angels.
With the angels. Now, some people think the second coming is Jesus is going to come back and he's still going to establish an earthly kingdom. It's going to take 1,000 years and all these other things. And Jesus is going to rule the earth. It never says Jesus is going to touch this earth again. It says we're going to meet him in the sky and he's going to be with his angels, right? His angels are going to reap and gather. And so first the dead are going to rise and then us. We'll meet him in the air. And so there's not going to be some 1,000-year thing. When Jesus comes back, we're going to know. Also, when you think about verse 28, the people in Thessalonica were confused. They thought they'd missed the coming of Christ. And that's when, if you go and read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, that's something that is just addressed over and over and over again. I assure you, you are not going to miss the second coming of Christ. We'll all know when it's here, because it's going to be the most glorious thing you've ever seen. For Christians, it'll be a horrendous day for non-Christians, but for us Christians, it is going to be the most glorious day. Let's see. Man, I almost made it to the Transfiguration. I'm going to say one part about the Transfiguration before I'll give you a word of thought going into next week, before I turn it over to Mark. Is still not here.
Mark isn't here, I guess it's me.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Dale. This is good. Before I turn it over to Dale. So if you go down to the Transfiguration, I want you to think about this one verse, in verse 8. So at the end of verse 7, so Jesus came and said to them, "Rise and have no fear." Now this is after they've fallen down. Verse 8, "And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only." Our goal, and I'll turn over to Dale before I just steal thunder on a invitation, but when we finally close our eyes here on earth, when we open them and we lift our eyes back up, our goal should be able to see Jesus. It's a beautiful thing. They saw no one but Jesus only. We're talking about the Transfiguration next week, but think about the fact that our life needs to be focused on the fact that when we finally close our eyes for the last time here on earth, the next time we get to see anything, we want to be able to see Jesus and Jesus in the kingdom. All right. Thank you all for being so kind. I'll turn it over to Dale for a devotional.
All right, let me shift gears. It's good to see you all here tonight. Good to have you with us. I appreciate Jacob and his ability very much in these lessons about Jesus, our Savior, and Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Messiah, and what his life means for us and the lessons that we can learn from that. I appreciate his lesson on Sunday night, a question from Jesus, because we're getting ready to start a series of questions on Sunday night, the questions that you have put in the box, the questions that you have asked, and so we're getting ready to start that series. And so it's kind of a good lead-in to have a question from Jesus first. I didn't even know he put one in the box, so it got by me. There was an old man who had gone to the doctor's office, and he had gotten his checkout, and he had checkup, and he had gotten in the car, and he was driving home. And as he was driving home, he got on the freeway, and his phone rang, and his wife was on the other end of the line, and she said she's been watching the news. He better pay attention to what he's doing. That there was one guy on the freeway who was going the wrong direction, and her husband said, "One guy? There's hundreds of them." Sometimes we can be going the wrong way. We can be going the wrong direction. I worked in manufacturing. Before I became a preacher, I worked in manufacturing for 20 years, and the majority of that time was spent in management, and I would oversee some things with regards to our suppliers for one of the businesses that I worked for. And sometimes we had suppliers that would make mistakes. They would have faulty parts that would come in, that we'd have problems with their parts, and we'd have to talk to them about it. And some vendors or some employees sometimes got to be problems over and over and over again, because they weren't pulling in the same direction as everybody else. And you thought, okay, I've talked to them about it, all right, we've sent these parts back, all right, we've had an employee review, have done all of these different things, and at some point you decide, all right, we've got to have a sit-down with these folks, we've got to have a major meeting with them, and we called it a Come Into Jesus meeting. We've got to have a Come Into Jesus meeting to see whether or not these folks are going to continue to be employees. We've got to have a Come Into Jesus meeting to see whether or not these folks are going to continue to be vendors, if they're going to continue to be suppliers of ours. And so sometimes you'll see that maybe with family members that have an intervention, they'll have a Come Into Jesus meeting with somebody and say, look, you got to get this straightened out in your life. We might do that with our employees, with our vendors. Sometimes sports teams will do that when you got somebody that's a prima donna on the team. And you sit them down and you say, look, we've got to have you're not pulling the same direction as everybody else is. Need to have a Come Into Jesus meeting. And what I want you to think about tonight is kind of piggybacking a little bit on what Jacob was talking about. We need to know where we are with regards to our Christianity. We might be going the wrong direction. Sometimes maybe we're not even aware that we're going the wrong direction. Sometimes maybe we need to check ourselves, because if Jesus was here and if Jesus was examining our life tonight, would Jesus say, you need to have a Come Into Jesus meeting? Would he look at us and say, we need to get some things straightened out once and for all? We're told to examine ourselves. Look over at 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5. Really verses 5 and 6. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 13 verses 5 and 6, he tells them, he says, examine yourselves as to whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you are disqualified? But I trust that you will know that we are not disqualified. He challenges them. They've had some problems in Corinth. If you read through these two letters that Paul writes to the Corinthians, that first letter, boy, he's laying into them that you're divided amongst yourselves. Some of you are saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Cephas, is Christ divided? Were you baptized for Paul? Right? Was Paul crucified for you? They've got divisions among them. There's a man who has his own father's wife, right, that he's messing around with. And they're trying to say, well, look at how loving we are. We're just accepting of everybody. And he's like, no, you got to straighten these things out. And so he writes them this pretty harsh letter. Now, they do rebuke this individual. We see it in 2 Corinthians that the rebuke of this individual, it works. Right? He comes back, he turns around from that, he examines himself and finds that what he's doing is wrong, and Paul's telling him, all right, he's repented of that, be gentle with him now. Don't lay too much upon him now that he's got his life back in order. But they had some problems here, and at the very end of this second letter, right, Paul's reminding them that you need to examine yourselves. Well, with what? We need to compare ourselves to a standard. We need to see, are we measuring up to what it is that Jesus has told us to do? Too often we want to measure ourselves based on everybody else. You know, compared to the rest of the world, boy, we're doing pretty good. Compared to that guy over there, boy, I'm doing a magnificent job. And we compare ourselves to the wrong standard. That's not the standard for us to compare ourselves to. It's the Word of God. It's what Jesus said. Jacob mentioned tonight, right? Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. It's his commandments that we need to measure ourselves against. And so we can look at this and we can see, are we in the faith? Are we doing what it is that Jesus has told us to do, or are we doing what we want to do, right? Are we following our own desires, or are we denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and following him? And so if you're here tonight, examine yourself. If you're not in the faith, if you're not in a saved condition with the Lord tonight, why not? Why not? The song, Are You Coming to Jesus Tonight, would have been a good song, but I don't know it well enough to lead it. But are you coming to Jesus tonight, right? Are you going to make that decision tonight? We need to make that decision tonight. We need to make that decision every day to come to Jesus, because he's the only one that can heal us of our sin problem. He's the only one that can provide us with eternal life. He's the only one who can help us. We can't lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We don't. In God's world, we don't even have boots. We need God. Where else could we go but to the Lord? If you have a need to respond to the invitation, if you need to get right with God because you've been living out of step, you've been pulling in the wrong direction, you can come to Jesus tonight and fix that. Maybe you need to be baptized for the remission of your sins. Maybe you need to study those things a little more. We'll be happy to do any of that. If you have a need, once you come and sit in these front sort of pews tonight, while we sing number 745, Where Could I Go But to the Lord? Let us all stand and sing. Living below in this old sinful world,